In the tranquil hush of a late autumn afternoon, a profound moment unfolded at Echo Park. Tucked away in an abandoned bus shelter, a young homeless black teenager, silently observing the world, became the sole witness to a terrifying scene. A 5-year-old boy tumbling into the cold lake. As the boy's mother descended into helpless panic, the teen without hesitation intervened. He expertly performed CPR, rescued the child, and then, as quietly as he appeared, walked away. His name remained unknown. He had no idea the child's father was a billionaire, and that this act of selfless courage would irrevocably alter his own life. Before we delve into this remarkable story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We always appreciate hearing your thoughts. It was a late autumn afternoon at Echo Park. The trees, sparsely covered, allowed the golden sunlight to filter through their branches, casting a warm, seasonal glow. Dry, brittle leaves rustled across the pathways in gentle gusts of wind, while the serene lake surface mirrored a sky softening into hues of orange. A weathered wooden bench, its slats worn smooth by time, sat beneath an ancient maple, silently overseeing the calm waters that had witnessed countless generations. Just beyond the manicured path, partially obscured by a line of hedges, stood a forgotten bus shelter. Its roof was dented, its plastic panels yellowed and cracked from years of neglect. Most people passed it by, assuming it vacant, a mere relic of the city's past. But nestled inside, in the deepest shadows of the far corner, sat a boy who seemed to belong nowhere else. Miles Carter, he estimated, was about 16. He'd stopped counting birthdays after his 14th, the last one he remembered celebrating before the community center closed. Since then, time had blurred into a cycle of seasons, of meals found and missed, of cold nights and warmer ones, and the quiet weight of uncomplaining loneliness. His skin was dark, his frame slender. His clothes, a mismatched collection of donations, hung loosely on him like ill-fitting narratives. Yet despite his worn sneakers and frayed hoodie, his eyes held an unwavering spirit, an unyielding alertness, a quiet dignity that needed no proclamation. Clutched in his lap was a tattered manila folder, its corners soft and curled. Inside, he meticulously kept CPR diagrams, handwritten notes, and first aid protocols, all carefully transcribed from discarded posters and pamphlets he'd found. It wasn't much, but to him it was everything, a blueprint not just for saving others but perhaps in some way for saving himself. He often sought the park in the late afternoons, not expecting events, but for its quiet solitude where people rarely looked too closely. He'd fill his water bottle at the drinking fountain and settle at the edge of the grass, reading his materials in the fading light, silently mouthing the steps like a protective chant. Today was no different. He had just finished reviewing the 30-to-2 chest compression ratio when a burst of laughter shattered his concentration. Glancing up, he noticed a small boy no older than 5, darting across the grass, his bright sneakers flashing as he chased a rubber ball down a gentle slope. Nearby, on a bench, a woman sat, poised and elegant, a laptop on her knees, a phone pressed to her ear. Her polished boots were crossed at the ankles, her eyes casually shifting between her screen and the child. This was Elena, though Miles didn't know her name then. She exuded purpose, like someone with a meticulously planned schedule, a fridge stocked with labeled containers, and a home that didn't echo with emptiness. The boy, Lucas, bounced with an infectious energy, embodying that invincible innocence that almost brought a smile to Miles's lips. The shoes on his feet looked brand new, the kind of vibrant, unblemished sneakers that left temporary marks on clean floors, the kind Miles once desired but no longer contemplated. He didn't watch them for long, just a fleeting moment, a blink, long enough to experience an unnamed sensation. Then he returned to his papers, tapping a finger along the sternum diagram, counting imaginary compressions. Behind him, the wind gently stirred, dislodging a few lingering leaves from the branches above. Elena stood, moving a few steps away to take a phone call in a quieter spot. Her back to the lake, her voice soft but clipped, the way people speak when trying to project calm while juggling multiple tasks. "Yes, I'm watching him. He's right in front of me. Go ahead, take the call. I'll be here another 15 minutes. Miles didn't intend to eavesdrop, but his ears, sharpened by years of self-preservation, effortlessly caught the words. Something in her tone, loving yet distracted, sounded familiar, like a memory from a cracked bedroom door long ago, before his home dissolved into foster lists and final signatures. And then the world tilted. It happened in an instant, a blinking missed sliver of time. Miles looked up again and Lucas was gone. The grassy slope he had just rolled his ball down now seemed steeper, the distant sound of ducks louder than it should be. Elena turned, still holding her phone, the color draining from her face as her eyes frantically scanned the horizon. Her lips moved, at first softly, then with rising panic. She stepped forward, then faster, then ran. Her phone dropped to the ground with a dull thud. A moment later Miles stood too, his eyes narrowing. From the lake's edge, just a few yards away, a small shoe floated silently, turning in slow circles like a lost petal. Elena's scream ripped through the stillness like a bolt of lightning, sharp, primal, the kind of sound that makes strangers freeze mid-step and birds flee their branches. "Lucas!" she shrieked again, louder this time, her voice raw with disbelief as her eyes scanned the waterline, refusing to accept what they saw. The small shoe, unmistakably bright green, bobbed gently near the reeds, a silent witness to something unspeakable. He didn't hesitate. There was no time for calculation, no room for fear, only a mother's instinct and a terrible surge of dread that stole her breath. In seconds her boots hit the water's edge, splashing through the shallows as she waded in, arms outstretched, hands trembling, heart galloping like a runaway train. Miles dropped his folder without realizing it. The sepia notes fluttered to the bench and then the ground, forgotten as his body moved before his mind could fully register. Something in the sound of Elena's scream ignited a fire in his bones, a silent command louder than any words. Do something. From his half-hidden position behind the shrubs, he could see her chest deep in the lake, pushing through the water, eyes wild, calling her son's name repeatedly. Her movements became desperate splashes, her cries fractured, rising into the air like smoke from a burning house. Then she stilled, gasped, and bent forward. When she re-emerged, she held a small body in both arms, limp and glistening like a broken doll. The sight of it nearly brought Miles to his knees. Lucas didn't move. His arms dangled, head slumped backward, eyes closed, lips tinged a terrifying shade of blue that should never belong on a child's face. Elena dragged him to the shore, stumbling, falling once but refusing to let go. She collapsed onto the grass, laying him flat, now sobbing, deep, choking sobs that tore from her throat with every shaky breath. Her hands moved erratically, unsure. She fumbled for her phone, called 911, screamed the words into the receiver, then dropped it beside her. With trembling hands she pressed on his chest, shouted his name, cried into his neck, trying to recall what she'd once read in a pamphlet or seen in a video. Was it 2 breaths then compressions or 30 then a breath? Her palms shook, her rhythm off, her mouth too close to panic to deliver air. She was drowning too, only her water was fear. Miles had never moved so quickly. He crossed the grass in long strides, ignoring the thudding of his heart and the tremor in his legs. As he reached them, he slowed, not out of hesitation, but to reassemble the fragments of his training that had scattered in his panic. Elena looked up, startled by his presence, eyes wide with confusion and suspicion, but also a sliver of hope, that last fragile thread people cling to when all else has unraveled. "I know what to do," Miles said, breathless but firm, his voice cracking not with fear but urgency. "Please let me try." For a second she didn't move. He was a stranger, a boy in ragged clothes, unknown and uncredentialed. But there was something in his eyes, steady, focused, almost older than his years, that made her hands fall back and her body shift aside. He dropped to his knees beside the boy and began. First, he gently tilted Lucas's head to open his airway, his fingers precise, respectful. He leaned close, listened for breath, watched the chest for movement, felt nothing but the cold press of silence. He pinched the boy's nose, sealed his own mouth over the small one, and gave 2 slow, deliberate breaths, watching the chest rise then fall. Then he placed his palms on the center of the chest, found the right spot between the ribs, locked his elbows and began compressions, 1, 2, 3. He counted under his breath, not allowed to dramatize, but to maintain the rhythm his body had memorized from paper countless times. 30 presses, then 2 breaths. Again, then again. Time stretched, warped, disappeared. Elena crouched nearby, frozen in a mix of awe and terror, hands pressed to her lips. Her son, her baby, lay so still, so unbearably still. And yet Miles kept going. Sweat dripped down his brow despite the chill. Arms aching, back screaming. But he didn't stop. He couldn't because he knew this moment. He had replayed it in his mind again and again. Every night he read those CPR steps beneath a flickering street light. But now it was real. A life, a child, not just practice, not theory. Then it happened. On the fourth round, just as he drew back from another breath, Lucas twitched slightly, then again. A wet, raspy cough erupted from his mouth, followed by a choking gurgle and a gasp so sharp it made Elena cry out. Water spilled from the boy's mouth as his chest convulsed, his eyes fluttering open, unfocused but alive. A sob broke from Elena, then another as she crawled forward, pulling her son into her arms, kissing his damp forehead, whispering his name repeatedly through broken tears. Miles exhaled. Not a victorious breath, not a proud one, but a breath of release, of quiet relief, of everything inside him unclenching. He sat back on his heels, hands shaking, legs numb, heart still racing as if it couldn't trust what had just occurred. Then in the distance he heard the rising whine of sirens, the unmistakable wail of paramedics closing in, tires crunching on gravel paths. He stood slowly, unsure what came next, unsure if he belonged in whatever new moment was forming now that the crisis had passed. Elena looked up, searching for the boy who had given her son back. But Miles, without waiting for applause or questions, turned away. He picked up his folder from where it had landed near the bench, brushed a leaf from its cover and walked back the way he came, disappearing behind the hedges just as the red and white lights spilled across the park. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already given all he had, and for someone like him that had to be enough. By the time the paramedics reached the lakeside, Elena was sitting on the grass, Lucas cradled tightly in her arms, his small chest rising and falling against her, his hair still damp and clinging to her cheek where her tears had fallen freely. She didn't look up at first, too stunned by the miracle that had just unfolded, too overwhelmed by the sheer fragility of those past minutes when she had hovered on the edge of losing everything that mattered. The medics moved quickly, their voices calm and practiced, checking the boy's vitals, asking Elena for details that blurred in her mind. She could only point behind her toward the hedge line where the boy, no, the young man, had just stood. He saved my son, she whispered. But when they turned to look, there was no one there. The bushes rustled in the light breeze, empty of movement, as though they had swallowed the stranger whole. Miles had already crossed the lot behind the park and disappeared into the quiet streets. The folder clutched to his chest like a secret. He moved quickly but without panic, not running, not hiding, simply slipping away the way those who have lived unnoticed know how to do. The world often overlooked boys like him, ragged, quiet, unclaimed. And now, even in the aftermath of something extraordinary, he knew better than to wait for anyone to ask his name. He had done what he came for, what he had trained for in silence and shadow, and that, in his mind, was all he needed. Recognition was for others. Survival was for him. At the hospital, Lucas was pronounced stable, the color returning to his face, his breath smooth though shallow from exhaustion. Elena sat beside him the whole time, holding his hand gently, brushing damp curls from his forehead, her other hand gripping an untouched paper cup of water. She replayed the scene repeatedly, the splash, the silence, the shoe, the panic, and then that boy appearing out of nowhere like something heaven sent, with hands that did not tremble, with a voice that steadied her own. She hadn't even asked his name. The realization struck her with fresh shame. In her terror, she had trusted him with her child's life. But not once had she thought to ask who he was, where he had come from, why he knew what to do. He had appeared, acted, and vanished. And all that remained was the certainty that her son was alive because of him. Mark arrived that evening, flying back from San Diego as soon as the call came in. His suit was wrinkled, his tie undone, his jaw set in that hard, determined way that often masked emotion behind practicality. When he walked into the room and saw his wife asleep in the corner chair and his son resting safely beneath a soft blanket, his breath caught. Elena stirred, woke slowly, then rushed to him, holding him tightly. "He's okay," she said into his shoulder. "He almost wasn't, but he is." They sat for a while in quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a storm when the heart is too full to speak. Then Elena told him what had happened. Not just the drowning, not just the CPR, but about the boy. He came out of nowhere. He knew exactly what to do. He saved Lucas. And then he left. Her voice wavered. "Mark, he didn't want anything. No name, no thanks. He just walked away." Mark, a man who dealt in metrics and outcomes, who valued accountability and structure, frowned, Not in doubt but in calculation. You said he looked young? Elena nodded. Maybe 16, 17. Poorly dressed, thin. Big. I think he might be homeless. Mark stood, pacing the hospital room slowly. We need to find him. Not just to thank him but to help him. Someone like that. Someone who could stay calm, think clearly, act with that kind of purpose. He deserves more than a sleeping bag in some alley. And so it began. The next morning a reward was announced. Not for capturing a suspect but for finding a hero. Flyers went up across the neighborhood with only a description. Unknown teenage boy, African American, approximately 16, seen leaving Echo Park after assisting in a child's rescue. Surveillance footage from city cameras was pulled and reviewed. Local news stations aired segments titled, "The Boy Who Vanished," inviting anyone with information to step forward. The city buzzed with curiosity, touched by the mystery and the humility of the act. In a world often jaded by headlines of cruelty and apathy, the story lit something rare. Hope that maybe not all heroes wore uniforms and not all good deeds came with hashtags. Yet Miles remained a ghost. He avoided crowded places, often changed his routes, and slept in different corners of the city depending on which shelters were less crowded or which alleys felt less observed. He had heard whispers of the search, seen a news segment once through the window of an electronics store, recognizing the words but not the face they spoke of. He didn't want recognition. What he quietly desired was to be useful. That moment in the park had given him something he hadn't dared hope for in years. A sense of meaning, of connection, even if only for a few minutes. He carried it like a flickering candle in a paper cup, shielding it from the wind, not wanting fame to extinguish it. But fate, as always, has its own timing. It wasn't a TV broadcast or a poster that eventually gave him away. It was an old trash collector, Mr. Bernard, who'd worked the same alley route for 20 years and remembered every face that offered a nod. One morning, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos on his break behind the bakery, he told the owner's wife, "I know that boy they're talking about. He's the one who picks through the bins real careful. Always leaves things tidy. Polite kid. Never asks for anything. He sleeps in the old bus shelter near Echo Park. I've seen him there reading something about medical stuff. I think he's one of the good ones." That single observation, spoken in passing, would lead Elena back to the boy who had saved her son. Not through search engines or private investigators, but through the quiet noticing of an ordinary man, the kind of noticing the world doesn't do enough of. And somewhere beneath the same maple tree where Lucas had once kicked his ball, where leaves now gathered thick as a golden carpet, the story that had begun in silence would begin again with a name. It was just after dawn when Elena returned to Echo Park, bundled in a wool coat she hadn't worn in years, its buttons still holding faint memories of gentler seasons. She clutched a small paper bag in one hand, fresh rolls and a thermos of warm tea, and in the other the soft, nervous hand of her son Lucas, who skipped beside her with the tireless energy of children newly healed, unaware of the layers of worry that lined his mother's eyes. The trees stood quiet around them, branches still dripping with the remnants of early mist, while the lake reflected a pale blush of sunrise. Elena didn't speak much as they walked the curve of the path, past the old bench, past the spot where the shoe had floated, and then around the bend they saw it, the shelter. It looked even smaller than she remembered, almost too fragile to have held the kind of strength that had once emerged from it. There was no movement at first, no sign of life, only a worn backpack propped beside a column and a half-folded blanket, frayed at the edges, tucked around something still and silent. Lucas let go of her hand and ran forward with that unfiltered, fearless joy that had returned to him like a second wind. "It's him, Mommy. It's him," he called, his voice rising like birdsong across the empty field. Elena approached more slowly, heart catching in her throat as she took in the boy who was not much older than a child himself, curled into a corner of the shelter, his eyes just opening, blinking against the morning light. Miles sat up slowly, instinctively reaching for his backpack, prepared to move, to disappear, to melt back into the edges of the world where he had lived for so long without being noticed. But then he saw the boy. Lucas stood before him, eyes wide and full of awe, his little hands outstretched as though seeing a superhero out of costume. "You saved me," he said plainly, honestly, with the absolute conviction of a child who had seen death and life in the same hour. Miles didn't know what to say. He looked down, then back up, unsure of what to do with such gratitude. He had been bracing himself for suspicion or rejection. Not this. Elena knelt beside her son, looking up at Miles with a quiet steadiness that seemed to say she had thought about this moment 1,000 times and still couldn't find words worthy of it. "We didn't get to thank you," she said softly. "I've looked for you every day since. We wouldn't have Lucas without you. I wouldn't have my son." Her voice cracked, the tea bag crinkling slightly as her hand tightened on the thermos. "You didn't just save him. You gave us time we thought we'd lost. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Miles shook his head, barely, his voice dry from sleep and shyness. "You don't owe me anything. I was just there." He paused. "It was what I knew how to do." Elena looked at him for a long moment, her eyes shining not with pity but something gentler, respect. She offered him the paper bag. "It's still warm. I didn't know what you liked, so I just got everything." Miles hesitated, then took it carefully as though afraid it might crumble if held too tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. They sat there for a while, the three of them, beneath the soft stretch of morning sky, with no cameras, no crowd, no noise but the gentle lap of water and the occasional chirp of a waking bird. It was Lucas who broke the silence again. He climbed onto the bench beside Miles, swinging his legs, and said, "I want to learn what you did. I want to save people too." Miles looked at him, startled by the purity of the wish, by the idea that something good might ripple outward from what had simply been a desperate act of kindness. Elena smiled at her son, then turned back to Miles. "If you want to go back to school, I can help. Not charity, not a favor, just something that feels right. There's a scholarship program my company sponsors. Housing, mentorship, education. I can make it happen. No conditions, just your choice." Miles opened his mouth, then closed it. Not because he didn't want to say yes, but because he had spent so long expecting to be invisible that the light now felt too bright, too sudden, like the first time you step from shadow into sun. He looked down at Lucas, who grinned back at him, unaware of the weight that lived behind his quiet eyes. "Would I have to wear a suit?" he asked, half joking. Elena laughed, a full, bright sound that surprised even her. "Only if you want to." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card, handing it to him gently. "When you're ready, we'll be here." For the first time in years, Miles didn't feel like moving away. He looked at the card, then at the boy, then at the woman who had come not to pity him, but to offer something far rarer, belief. And for the first time he let himself believe too. Not in miracles, not in fate, but in the simple, ordinary possibility that maybe he didn't have to be alone anymore. Maybe this world still had space for a boy who had once learned CPR by reading in the dark. Maybe this was not the end of something but the beginning. It had been nearly a year since that cold morning in Echo Park. Almost 12 months since a shoeless boy in a tattered hoodie knelt beside a dying child and chose to give everything he had without expectation. Seasons had turned gently since then, in the quiet way they do when life moves forward, not with spectacle but with steady, faithful steps. The shelter where Miles once slept had been replaced with a small community garden, quietly funded by a local grant, though a bench remained near the spot where Elena and Lucas had first found him, and from time to time, a single sunflower would appear, unplanted by human hands, leaning toward the lake as though remembering. Now, inside the warm light of the city's community learning center, where walls were lined with posters about first aid and emergency response, and the scent of pencil shavings and hand sanitizer mixed with the distant aroma of cafeteria food, Miles stood at the front of a classroom, not as a student but as an instructor. He wore a simple gray hoodie still, though this one was clean and new, and a laminated name badge clipped to his collar, a quiet proof of belonging he never once took for granted. Before him sat a group of parents and teenagers, most of them initially unsure, skeptical about spending their weekend learning CPR, but softened now by the calm, patient presence of the young man who spoke with gentle authority and a kind of wisdom that didn't come from lectures but from lived moments. He moved through the steps carefully, his hands demonstrating on the training dummy as he spoke, his voice steady, warm, never rushed. "Remember, your hands go here," he said, pressing gently over the sternum. "Not too high, not too low. Lock your elbows. Push hard, push fast. If you're scared, that's okay. Do it scared. But do it because someone's life may depend on whether or not you're willing to act." The room was quiet, attentive. Even the children fidgeted a little less when he spoke, sensing perhaps that this wasn't just a lesson. It was a gift passed down from the brink of something unforgettable. In the back row, Lucas sat with his arms folded proudly across his chest, a handmade pin on his shirt that read, "Junior Responder." He had begged to attend every session not because he needed the certificate, but because in his heart, Miles had become something larger than a friend. He had become the very definition of what it meant to care without hesitation. And Elena sat beside her son, smiling softly, watching the way Miles commanded the room, not with volume or performance but with presence. And she thought again, as she had so many times, how easily this story could have ended in grief. Yet here they were, alive, connected, building something quiet and good out of what once had been a near tragedy. Lucas tugged on his sleeve and said, in that completely earnest tone only a child can carry, "One day I'm going to be like you." Miles crouched down eye level with him and placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "No," he said with a grin that finally reached his eyes, "one day you'll be better." And perhaps that was what made it so remarkable. Not that he had saved a life, not even that he had turned his own life around, but that he had done it with no need for applause, no hunger for credit. He had simply seen someone in need and responded, not with fanfare but with faith in himself, in the possibility of goodness, in the belief that a small act can ripple outward and remake the world in quiet, tender ways. He never asked to be called a hero. He never wore the title. But for one family, for one boy, and now for an entire room of future responders, Miles would always be remembered as the one who stepped forward when it would have been so much easier to stay unseen and chose without hesitation to help. And that was enough. That was everything. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.